All right, let's talk about speculative fiction. So, a few weeks ago, I put out a video where I was talking about magical realism and I discussed what books worked and what didn't work for me, and just some thoughts in general about magical realism and what is it. And after making that video, I started thinking about a very sort of similar topic, which was speculative fiction. And it worked out really well because I had a nice discussion with another viewer about it, and she asked if I would do a video on speculative fiction, and I told her actually I had already started working on it. So here it is. And yeah, let's start by just talking about what is speculative fiction. Then I will share some books that I have read of speculative fiction and my thoughts on them, some books that are on my TBR, to be read list for speculative fiction, including books that I own as well as some that I don't own yet but want to read. So, what is speculative fiction? Well, I kind of did a little research to get sort of a more concrete definition of it, and I ended up finding one on a university website that I really liked and pretty largely agreed with. And so, I will include a link to that page where they talk about it at length. But in brief, the definition that we're going to be working with today as we talk about speculative fiction is a type of fiction, typically a subgenre, but sometimes considered a genre in its own right. And it's very plot and action driven, typically has a good amount of world building in it, and is also exploring the idea of possibility or impossibility and sort of answering the question of what if. So I'm going to start with the books that I have read. I will also try to mention if there is some other genre that these books sort of overlap with. And the first book that I have read that we're going to talk about is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This is also considered a work of literary fiction, but I could also see how it could be categorized as speculative fiction. And particularly for my own books, I'm going with what the Storygraph labeled as speculative fiction, but I may mention a few others as well. Piranesi, I would say, explores the question of what if you woke up one day and didn't remember who you were, how you got to a strange house full of caves and water, and all you had to work with was a diary that apparently you wrote but have no memory of ever having owned. And it's a very interesting premise, a well written story, very short book as well, that really just explores psychologically what that could do to you. And it's kind of its own unraveling mystery. I really enjoyed reading this book and I gave it 5 stars. A young adult novel that I have read that is considered speculative fiction is They Both Die at the End. This was a very fascinating, very plot driven, and fast paced book. And it explores the question of what if you found out 24 hours in advance that you were going to die? What would that day look like? What would you do? How may that or may that not change things in your behavior, who you are, and how you spend the day? And this is a really great book that, even though the title is kind of a spoiler, you still can't help but wonder like what's going to happen at the end. They Both Die at the End was a book that I had heard a lot about and finally got to. I think it was just last year, sometime earlier in the year, maybe over the summer, and I gave it 4 stars. Another subgenre that you will find frequently connected with speculative fiction is dystopian. Not every speculative fiction work is dystopian, as you can already see, and not every dystopian is speculative fiction. But in the case of Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler, I would say the two are sort of hand in hand. It is both a dystopian novel, which is ultimately exploring like what if everything went wrong in the world, but in this case, I feel like it also speculates about religion and community and safety and the idea of safety. And what happens in a world where things just start to become unsafe. I read this just earlier this summer. This is an amazing book that I highly, highly recommend to anyone interested in any genre. If you have not tried Octavia E. Butler, I think this is a great place to start with her. Not that I've read a lot of her work, but I definitely thought that this book was a better place to start than Kindred, which is the other book that I've read by her. So of the two works of hers that I've read, start here. um, and I did give this book clearly 5 stars. Another 4-star speculative fiction read for me was Ella Minnow P. This is another work that is also considered literary fiction, and I read this book quite a while ago, but I still think about it sometimes because it is just such a fascinating look at what would happen to your language, to your life, and to your world if every day you lost the use of one letter in the alphabet. It is such a great book full of puns. I mean, you can see that even in the title. And the whole book just has that tone. It is also epistolary, if that's not something that you've heard somebody mention about this book. And I gave it a 4-star, which may sound surprising because I did really like the book and I held on to it for a very, very long time, thinking that I was going to reread it. And there were occasional times where I picked it up to do so and just found I wasn't that interested in going back to the story. I enjoyed it for what it was and I like thinking about it, but for some reason it just wasn't a style that I wanted to get back into and had its own, I don't know, barriers to entry, I guess. And so I just haven't reread it. And that's one of the things that is required for me to consider a book a 5-star read. I need to want to reread it. That said, I would still highly recommend this book, especially if you like language and puns and all those kinds of things. All right, that brings us to my unread books. So I'm going to start with the books that I physically own, and we're going to talk a little bit about those. This is a good stack of books to maybe try, but I can't tell you whether or not they're good ones. So if you're looking for recommendations, it's probably those first 4 that I've mentioned. But the next ones that I'm going to mention are all, in theory, part of speculative fiction. Okay, so the first book that I'm going to talk about is Egalia's Daughters. This is a satire of the sexes by Gerd Brantenberg, and this covers the idea of what if gender roles were switched? What if women wielded all the power and men stayed home and did the household chores and took care of the children? It's obviously going with very classic sort of Western and patriarchal gender roles being swapped here. So do keep that in mind. But it apparently explores in depth and very humorously the idea of gender roles and traditional gender powers, changing places, and whatever, I don't know, shenanigans happen from there. I also have The Alchemist. This is definitely one that is being categorized as speculative fiction, more by Storygraph than me. I have not read this book, and even looking at reviews of it, I can't really figure out why this would be considered speculative fiction. So, if without a spoiler, you can tell me what sort of impossibility or possibility this is exploring, I'd be very interested to know. And you can leave that in the comments below for all of us. The next work I have is Dhalgren. This is also a work of science fiction, and I have heard some very interesting things about this book. But from what I can tell, this explores the idea of what if a poet, lover, and adventurer came into a town full of criminals. So I'm guessing it's exploring, sort of the peace, love, and happiness versus crime. I don't know. But I've heard a lot of fascinating things, not only about the premise of this book, but also just about the way it's written. And so I'm very interested in getting to this one day. Yeah, I am just very fascinated by this book. Like I mentioned, it is a work of science fiction, and it is considered a science fiction classic from my understanding. The next work that I have is The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. This would be considered speculative fiction because it explores alternate history, which is a common category. It explores the idea of what if the United States and the Allies lost the war. And so it is the year 1962, and one of the things that has happened is slavery is again legal. So this explores a lot of very heavy topics related to the idea of the impossible becoming possible, or maybe not the impossible, but again, an alternative history. And the last 2 books that I have here are both what I would consider dystopians. So they follow that sort of futuristic element that you will frequently find in speculative fiction, but they land on the side of like if the future has gone wrong. And that would be the Grievers series, including the book Grievers as well as Maroons. These are books that are set in Detroit and follow the question of what if a city was quarantined because a mysterious plague came and started killing people in the city. And yeah, definitely hits a little close to home in terms of pandemics, but it explores like how do you navigate that? How do you deal with the grief? How do you deal with the city that is emptying out? And I think it's very fascinating that it's based in Detroit. I feel like I don't know that I've ever read any book that's based in Detroit. And having recently been to Detroit in the last year or so, I have a much greater appreciation for Detroit as a city itself and a lot of curiosity about its history, which apparently that series explores in depth. So I have three other books to talk about real quickly that are also examples of speculative fiction, which I think are just interesting because they're sort of slightly different genres, and some of them may be familiar to you. One of them is the book Black No More. This again goes through and deals with ideas surrounding possibilities of race and changes there. And the other two books are both in the Hainish cycle by Ursula LeGuin. One is The Dispossessed, and the other one is The Left Hand of Darkness. Those could also be considered works of speculative fiction. Finally, if you have a book and you are wondering if it's a work of speculative fiction or if any of the books that you have read are speculative fiction, there are other elements you can look for in your books. And I have mentioned some of them in this video. So things like, is there an alternate history being explored? Are there futuristic elements that are being explored? And not so much just in terms of are there scientific things being explained, but sort of is the idea of what the future might look like being explored specifically as a major theme in the book. This is something you typically find in dystopians and utopians. You can also have books whose main genre is fantasy that may also have a subgenre of speculative fiction. And these tend to be fantasy novels that have elements that are exploring the possibilities or impossibilities of magical creatures or of characters having magic. And the final element you might want to look for is a non-realistic setting. So it is set on a different planet or in a different sort of sphere. So a good example of this would be The Hobbit, where it's sort of exploring what if there was a different side of our world, or maybe is taking place in a different world altogether, as well as other fantasy books that might explore things like, well, what if everything in the world was normal, but there were elves or some sort of other magical creature or character involved. So again, a lot of times you're going to have these elements mixed in with the subtle question of life as is, but what would happen if this thing existed? Magic in general is one that is explored as an element of speculative fiction. And again, whether the book is categorized as fantasy or speculative fiction, I think generally has to do with how much of that theme or topic of what if is being explored in a particular book. All right, so here's my stack that I am considering reading of speculative fiction. Based on the books that I have read in the past, I can say I'm pretty sure I'm going to enjoy these books. Now, I've only read 4. I think I had read more books of magical realism, but I have to say, overall, I seem to enjoy books with speculative fiction in them way more than the books that have magical realism in them. And I will say that there are books that have magical realism in them that also have speculative fiction in them as well. I think Piranesi is a really good example of that. So I will be interested to read more of these books, hopefully over the next year. And yeah, really explore speculative fiction more and see if this is really what is drawing me to these types of books that have some magic in them more than the magical realism itself. So if you like one, you may want to try the other. And if you haven't tried this subgenre or genre in general, I definitely suggest giving it a try. Like I said, most of these books tend to be pretty fast paced and they definitely tend to be more plot driven than character based. So if that's something that appeals to you, you might also like speculative fiction. Let me know what you have read that's speculative fiction and you've enjoyed, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye. Is this a joke? Hang on. I gotta go take care of this. There's like some weird combination of pigeons, squirrels. I hear you. Get out of there. No, you can't stay here. Go build your nest somewhere else. I tell you, I'm getting obnoxious over there. Okay, where was I?